Hey woodworkers, welcome back. So I want to talk about water-based finishes, and they're, they're the new kids on the block for sure. There are some newer finishes for our applications, but this is something that I think is just new enough to create still some confusion about type and application and what is actually in the stuff, and then also old enough to feel like it's somewhat trustworthy. And so we just need to be cautious about what it is that we're getting into. Um, First, the bad news. So water-based finishes, they have a reputation for changing the color of the wood that you're finishing with. A lot of times with a darker wood, this will affect things a bit more severely. So I've got a sample of Padauk over here, which has this waterborne finish on it. I'm not sure if you can make out any of this. So I finished this, or applied this finish years ago on Padauk, and this was just something that was going to go to a project that never became realized, so it's kind of sat waiting. And then this is the raw piece of Padauk, or piece of Padauk. And so with an oil-based finish or a solvent-based finish on this, the color would be pretty dramatically different. It doesn't show up terribly well in the video, potentially, but there's kind of a marked difference between these two. And if this one again was finished with something non-water-based, it would be much darker. So, having said that, the reputation that this stuff is trying to fight or get past is that it affects the color of darker woods, and it makes them either feel washed out, or gives it kind of a white hue to it. And so a lot of reasons that water-based isn't used on darker woods is that reason. But on a lighter-based wood, on maple, maple, birch, ash, all of those would be great candidates for this finish because they're already a very light color. There are ways to tweak and adjust that, but it gets into mixing the some type of a dye into the finish, and it just gets messy. All right. So this is my finishing board. I'm going to apply water base on this when we get to it. Sand it to 220 as we do. But in mixing this material, we need to start measuring the material out in the right proportions. Before I do that, I didn't mention the good news. So the good news about water-based finishes is that they dry incredibly quickly, and more akin to a shellac or lacquer realm. It's admittedly slower than both of those two at drying, depending on the lacquer you're using. But that's a big benefit, and relatively durable, and a good selection for most furniture applications. A lot of floor refinishing people have gone to a water-based option because of that reason. And if you imagine sanding the entire floor, cleaning everything up, putting down an oil-based finish onto the flooring, and then waiting for that to cure. Number one, your clients can't live in the house that night if they're lucky. If they're unlucky, for the next 2 nights. But anyway, you can use water-based finishes on the flooring. It dries much faster, and you should be in a better standing there. The bad news about water-based finish is that, as the name suggests, there's a lot of water in that finish. And so what that does is two things. On a small surface here, it's going to raise the grain or swell the fibers of this board. So in the prep work, sanding, you have got to wet the wood, and then after it dries, then sand it up to whatever your final grit is, and then you shouldn't have any problems with this. For flooring people, what they do is wetting the wood and then sanding between coats is not terribly practical, but they will lay down a coat of a shellac or something to seal the wood, and then after that's cured, then they can put down their water-based finish. Okay, enough about flooring. So the other thing to watch out for is that I've got a couple of different examples of the stuff. This one promotes itself as a water-based finish, and this is great and widely used in a lot of industrial applications that we probably have in the house for wood products. This one, it doesn't really suggest that it is based in water. There's a couple of clues. They're talking about a spar urethane, which suggests from that language that it would be oil-based. But then it's saying, all right, fast drying or fastest drying. That's interesting. And then they also have a mark here, crystal clear, and very tiny text, water-based. So all of those things are a little bit misleading until you get to the water base. A good rule of thumb is to read the back of the container as far as the cleanup, which in here, and it suggests water. And so if it's a solvent-based finish, water is not going to do you any good. So if you read that on either of these finishes, water-based here as well, then that's your clue. So knowing what it is you're getting is important, and going from there. Okay, so I have my scale, and the reason for it is that with water-based finishes, they are very particular about how much dilution can happen with the finish to some type of a thinning agent. So a lot of times it would be a solvent, if it's lacquer, polyurethane, or shellac. With water-based, then it's going to be distilled water, not tap water. Those are fighting words to the powers that be. But we can easily over mix the ratio of the finish to the solvents or the vehicle here. So what they recommend, this manufacturer recommends no more than 10%. So thinning or cutting this no more than 10% for your application, which is great. Other manufacturers are almost 20%, but that's it. It's no 50%. It's, if you go too much of this, there's such little solids left in the finish that it's just going to be so thin and runny. It's going to take forever to build up, and it starts to break down the chemical makeup of this finish. Okay, so depending on how much I would need to mix, I would look at my scales here, and I can't do 1-to-1, or even 9-to-1 is a little bit too much. Actually, I could do 9-to-1, but anything more than that, it starts to get tricky. And if I just need enough finish for this tiny surface here, I really don't want to use this scale here, 9-to-1, filling up this volume, because that's a million times overkill from that. So this is out. Even if I had a smaller cup, same rules apply. I'm going to have way more product than I really need for doing the application. So getting rid of this one at least. What I'm going to do instead is use my digital scale, which I think is the right choice here. What you didn't see is that I've already stirred the finish before I started recording. And you'll need to do that on every finish just to make sure that there's no solids that are hanging out somewhere, all right, in the can. All right, so with this scale, and digital scales are all pretty straightforward, but there's a really annoying piece that I can turn this on, it's going to calibrate, and then it tells me, great, I'm at 0. But the second I add anything to it, it's going to start weighing these things out. And so I need to recalibrate here. I said recalibrate. All right, so now it's at 0. Then that's what I want to do is get a clean slate, but I want to have both of these containers in place. One will be for the water, one will be for the material, the finish. So if I'm going to do a 10% solution here, or a 10% thinning, then what I'll need to do is lay these things out in the right way. So I'm going to start with this material, and the annoying thing I was talking about with digital scales is that sometimes if you're not active enough, they start to freeze and just shut off. This is not going to be pretty. All right, distilled water. So I'm at 1 ounce even. I'm going to go 1.1 ounce, which should give me what I need. And that is fantastic. Another way of doing all of this, if the ounces is a tricky target to hit, then we can switch this to grams, and then the math is so much easier because we're dealing with solid numbers and a much more sensitive system. So, okay, so great. The hard part is past us. So getting rid of that, getting rid of you. Now I have my two materials. Goodbye scale. All right, so I have a clean container here that I want to use. I've mixed in, yeah, there we go. I'm telling you, one day I'm going to get so good at this stuff. All right, so I have those in there. I don't want to shake these. Just want to stir all of this. And as thin of a finish as this is, this should be a breeze. All right, so I have my finish in there. I want to let that settle a little bit because the bubbles that have been created just with that gentle agitation, I don't want to have show up later on in the finishing. I want to do it this way. Okay, so we talked about, or we have talked about brushes in the past. For water-based finishes, because they dry so quickly, I feel like a bristle brush, and this would be a good one, a good candidate for synthetic bristles. If it's a large surface, small surface like this, I could get away with this. It's just a little clunky for this size. But if it was a larger tabletop, then you're going to run into a situation potentially, depending on the temperature and relative humidity. I can brush over here, and then when I come back around, then this part could already be dry, so I'm starting to get this tack or stickiness that happens. So this application, bristle brush is much better for just cleaning this stuff off. All right, the better application tool is going to be a foam brush, and they have different sizes of these. This one is probably good, but I kind of like the size of this medium-sized brush to get in there. And with that said, I'm going to insert the foam in here. And I'm just going to allow this to be broadcast until I start to charge this foam. It's still going to get a little dry. I need to reload a little more frequently. All right, so one thing that I'm doing here that's I want to point out that you might not understand until you do this. All right, it's perfect. So when starting to apply this finish, if I start on the edge, the tendency is going to be that I'm going to drag this over, and you can see all the reasons why that's a horrible idea. So what I do, or get into the habit of doing, is starting in the center and working my way out. Not worried about evenness yet. I'm just trying to get that board covered. I'm also elevating this board, as you can see, because if I do get any drips or sags, I just want to make sure that all of that is dealt with, and I can still lift this board off the bench. So what I'm noticing here is I'm running into a lot of bubbles, which I don't like, and I think if doing this again next time, first of all, I'm just taking care of those drips before they become an issue. If I'm doing this next time, I would probably not dilute this finish at all and just go straight. The difference of 100% and 10% of this application is really not that much. And so, yeah, you can kind of see what's happening with this. So I think it's just not worth, no, I do want to go back there. It's just not worth all the bubbles here, and it just feels a little thin. If you ever run into a situation where you have a lot of these bubbles, you can remove them. The brush, people sometimes do that, but then that just starts to create a new environment for that material to pool or to be unevenly distributed. But if I have bubbles here, I'm going to try to focus on this. You can easily just blow them out. So I'm sorry if you saw my face in there, but by blowing these things, I can remove them. This works a lot better on oil-based finishes because it dries so slowly, and typically that would be applied with a bristle brush, and so those bubbles are a bit more serious. But that's the deal here. Still being cautious about any foreign material in here. If there's a lot of sawdust or other woodworking activity, this is going to grab a hold of it, and letting it go means you have to sand it off until you remove it, unless you see it when it's wet, and then you can get in and start poking some of those things out. Good. All right. These brushes, especially since they're water based, these can be rinsed out in the sink, and that's great. Given that these are super cheap and designed for a disposable application, that's another option as well. But I just feel like this is the easiest way to apply these. Once this dries, then we're going to sand with 320 wet dry paper, and then we'll reapply and continue to do these things. The rule that I have always followed is that the application of the first coat can be diluted. Subsequent coats need to be closer to full strength, or full strength for that last coat, and that's your finish. But hopefully with that first image of the Padauk with finish on it, you can see after it's being finished, and I'm talking about finishing the finishing or rubbing out the finish, you can get a really beautiful sheen and really consistent. And yeah, I just like this product. That's that. All right, happy finishing. Don't forget, water-based stuff is our friend. Thanks.